Social consciousness, by virtue of it being expressed and pronounced and exemplified throughout the hierarchy of social experience. When we say hierarchy, we mean in reference to the intersections between social sentiment. But the point of the matter is that in a case where it is exemplified to an utmost degree or stronger than a neutral state, which we will discuss as what is considered normal in that polarity. When we find such a scenario, then it can be problematic in the cases in which the exemplification succeeds any level of articulation that can just sequence between two parts. For example, as noted, one who's walking to a courthouse as a defendant, they must keep a motionless expression because whatever expression will be used against them. The point is that in reference to something so strong as an exemplification, as in that case a representation, the cost or the expense is of such paramount significance that the social arena doesn't have the tools to proceed with nuance and discrepancy. Therefore, it is almost as if it must be ignored, not for the fact that there is no social sentiment, but from the very fact that it exemplifies way more than the possibility of articulation. We cannot articulate in coherent form the defendant as according to its sentiment and its conscious backing in a manner that is suited to the scenario without moving towards the overload of its information, and thus will disallow a sequential or purposeful outcome that details the truth of the matter. And this way we notice the trait and character as noted by the Hellenic tradition or the Greek philosophers of judgment, because even in the case scenario of high degrees of social exemplification, that of the defendant, and it's a perfect example because when they do enter the court and they sit through judicial proceedings, it is in that scenario closed doors, wooden panels, judge, jury. The whole scenario is built in order to proceed towards good judgment that doesn't have the social exemplification. And in fact, if the jury is to be determined to follow the social exemplification rather than the judicial proceeding, that they're dismissed for impartial judgment. Therefore, even in the case preceding the entrance to the judicial proceeding, one can utilize their individualized judgment to analyze the scenario in a coherent manner that doesn't show partialization to the exemplification, meaning to say that in truth there is more to unpack, and the higher degree does send one into a case of overwhelming consciousness dealings, if you would call it that. And because of that, the judicial layer or the approach through judicial development as though a character trait, that would allow for the detailed analysis that wouldn't give rise to the extreme measures of the social exemplification. Therefore, it must be noted in the case scenarios where the social exemplification is of too much regard that it is that scenario either to ignore or neglect, for one recognizes that whatever they proceed upon, they will not be entering the truth of the scenario, but rather its exemplification, which could be a study in itself in how that exemplification intersects with the social consciousness of that period in time. But in terms of gaining the access to the details of truth in a form of coherency and discrepancy, that can only come about from either neglect or separation, to which now they can enter back into that scenario without the high degree of efficiency that would be in the regular scenario. For example, one can separate from a high representation, something that pulls together too much information, disregard its significance, separate their proposition of social sentiment, and after the fact, adjacent to it, just by default measure of it probably coming back into one's purview, in that case they can enter with some separation, with some layer of nuance, and in that they gain access to those details without the possibility of overload, for the very fact that they've ignored or disallowed the general social sentiment to take heed. This is why it's explicitly the high degree of social sentiment that must be mostly regaled to something otherworldly or disallowed to enter regular social discourse, not because it is not efficient, but because it is too efficient. It is too sterile for a detailed analysis, because it requires that level of medicinal separation or sterile hyper purpose. And because of that, it can now be entertained based on that level of separation. Now, to return to the fact that, as we mentioned, there is a neutral social consciousness or social sentiment that, in that case, would be perfect of a scenario to analyze, because it is there that one doesn't feel overwhelmed by its consciousness expansion. And because of that, they are able to continue unabated. And it is actually the case that it is yesteryear's social consciousness that is most perfected to be today's neutral detail analysis, because prior to that case, it was too much of an exemplification, but still an obvious extension of being the purposeful approach to social consciousness, so that one can return to that scenario, gain access to its lineage and its purpose, while still not dealing with its overwhelming nature. For example, in the case of an extreme explosion of newsworthy detail, only after the fact, 2 weeks later, a month later, whenever that dissipates and regular social consciousness has let go of the fact of the matter, then one can return to it while still being relevant. It is not socially alive to the point where one may become stuck in the overwhelming nature and lose the nuance and become lost to the scenario and become impartial to the analysis. Now, it is not only the effect of the analysis that is the cost, but it's also, which as a cost would be the judgment as a trait, as the Greek would term the virtue of judgment. But it is also the case that whatever information is regarded has no effect on the development of the psyche because of the overwhelming nature of that experience, meaning the conscious sentiment goes through the psyche, unable to deter and differentiate into specific pathways based on the personal development and based on the social lineage beforehand and afterwards. It takes away the history of that ascension as well as the future possibility of other details and goes fully into the memory bank without detail. It's overloading the individuality and therefore loses not only the analysis and the trait of judgment, but also the individuality of the psyche that will also have the negative outcome of being unable to be differentiated unless one returns to that overwhelming traumatic imprint and differentiates it in backwards process. Now that is a discussion for another time, and how one would approach the overwhelming detail that has been imprinted on the psyche, for there is rectification in that process, but it is a reversion of the process of their dealings. Therefore, there is a cost, there is an expense to their daily living, but there is a possibility of fixing the differentiation or the need of distribution of the psyche. It is imprinted on the psyche without distribution, and it is now upon the psyche to differentiate those details which, if participated from the original stance through the modality of differentiation or with the virtue of judgment of impartialization, then it would be the case scenario of perfecting both the daily process of exploration and the differentiation of the psyche, and that would be seemingly virtuous in a somewhat universal sense.